All right, so here is a brief recap of our class on June 11th, and I'll also review some of our class on June 4th if you missed either of those. So what we covered was mostly rhythm, and mostly about time signatures and what metronome markings meant, and also just how rhythm breaks down. So I'm just going to go through real quickly the things we talked about. So first off, let's go through time signatures. So time signature is something you will find at the beginning of all music, and it is a little code. And what this code means is it's really a fraction. So the upper number will show you how many notes, and the bottom number will show you what value of note. And this will make even more sense in a second. So the top number will just show you how many, right? So for example, it could be 4 notes. And the bottom number will show you what type of note. So let's say it's a whole note. So a measure that is 4 whole notes will look something like this. Okay? And if you, a measure is just showing you that measurement of time. Now, the confusing number, or part of this, is honestly the value of the note, because that's a little bit of a code. So let's just break it down. And this is something I call the rhythm tree. Okay? And this is just how music breaks down, how rhythm breaks down in music. So at the very beginning of music notation, early music notation, the basic note value was the whole note, which makes sense if you think about it objectively. You might not be used to thinking about it that way if you are used to reading music already, but at the beginning, right, a note was just simple. It was just a circle, right? Uncomplicated. So this is a whole note. Okay, so that's the name. Now the number that will go in this value, right, is a 1. So if you see a 1 in a time signature, then you know what it is counting is the whole note. So now this will break down in 2. So if you divided a whole note in half, you would get half notes. That makes sense, right? It's just math. So we call these half notes because it's just half of a whole note. The symbol for this is a 2. You'll see a pattern very quickly for how this works. But the whole note and these 2 half notes will occupy the same amount of time. Okay? And then these break down again, right? These are called divisions. So these are divisions and subdivisions, you also will hear them being called. So if you broke a half note down in half, then you would get a quarter note, right? And these are called quarter notes because they're a quarter the value of a whole note. This is very different than probably a lot of you might have learned in music, in school for music. But these are called quarter notes because they're a quarter the value of a whole note. I was first taught that a quarter note was a quarter note because it was a quarter of a measure, but that is not why it is called a quarter note. It is called a quarter note because it's the quarter of a whole note. And this, you might have guessed, will show up as a 4 if it was in a time signature. And this can keep breaking down like indefinitely, right? So this breaks down. The next smaller unit of this breaks down into, oh, I did something crazy here. I'm so sorry. I got too excited, okay? I broke this down an extra time than necessary, right? So this just breaks down like this, I'm so sorry, into 4. Right, that would make more sense. I got excited. I started to do this part already, right? Now this is the fun part, okay? So a quarter note breaks down into half, and it breaks into an 8th note, right? Because an 8th note will take up an 1/8 of a whole note. So it will take 8 eighth notes to make up the same amount of time as a whole note. Now, eighth notes can be written a couple different ways. You'll see them. One way is to have these little flags like that, and one way is for them to be connected with a beam like this. And the beams are just faster to write, honestly, than having little flags, and it's just a little easier to look at. But these are called eighth notes. Right? Again, they're called that because they're the eighth of a value of a whole note. And the symbol, right, is an 8. If you broke this down one more time, right, this could technically go on forever, right? Then these would be broken down and these would become 16th notes. And 16th notes get a second flag. Okay. Okay, and so forth. And if these were beamed together, they would look very similar. Or they'd have two notches there. Okay, so these are 16th notes. Takes a little bit of getting used to writing on an iPad like this, but and the symbol for that would be 16. Okay, so that is the rhythm tree. This is how rhythm breaks down simply. Okay? So everything breaks down into half, and just to look up just to show you a few examples of what this would look like. So we could have a measure that is 4-1, right? Like I said before. And this would mean that there are 4 whole notes in a measure. Boom. That's a measure. We could have a measure that's 4-2. That would mean there are 4 half notes in a measure. You could have a measure that's 4-4. This is what we're used to seeing, okay? This has become very, very common, the most common time signature to use, honestly. Okay? But it could go down and we could do 4-8, and then we would have 4 16th notes. Or I'm so sorry, 4 8th notes, right? It could be this. And lastly, just while we're at it, right, it could be 4 16th notes. My notation could look prettier, right? So all of those examples were with 4 being the top number, but I just want to point out that that number could be anything. It could be 7, right? It could be 7-1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In theory, right? It could be any number of notes in a measure. It's just a little guideline for showing you how many notes are in what, right? So this is the rhythm tree. Remember, this is very important, how time signatures work and what they're showing you. And then the question came up was to how fast do these notes go? Well, a whole note could be as fast as you decide, but at the beginning of pieces of music, you'll see something called, that is a tempo indication, right, and a tempo marking. I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see these are the notes from the previous class. I'll just erase these real quick so you can look at this with fresh eyes here. Okay. But right here is the tempo indication. And what that's showing you is that a quarter note, you can see there, equals 54 beats per minute. So that equals, it's very close to it being 60 beats per minute, right? In other words, a beat a second, almost. A little slower than that, right? Now, if it was 60, let's just, right? If it was this, right, that would be 1 beat, 1 every second. There'd be 60 quarter notes that happened in a minute, right? But again, right, this note value could be anything. We could make a half note that fast. So we can make it so there are 60 half notes in a minute, right? Or we could even be crazy and make a whole note equals 60, right? But that is how we find out how fast these note values go by. And the tool we use to figure that out is called a metronome. You have probably seen these or used them or heard them, but I'm so sorry. As a conductor, right, that's what I function as. I function as a metronome. I show the beat, right, and the beat is whatever that tempo marking indicates. So half note, a quarter note, or a whole note, or so forth. So that is more or less what we went over in our class, in the last 2 classes. Hopefully that makes sense, right? The big takeaway is what this time signature thing is showing, how many notes and what type of notes in a measure, and then understanding how this rhythm tree breaks down, all based off of the whole note, right? And the whole note is our base note of how rhythm is notated and why rhythmic notes and rhythmic values are given the names that they're given. The whole note, half of a whole note, quarter of a whole note, an eighth of a whole note, and a 16th of a whole note, and so forth. So I hope that makes some sense. Before we go, I'll just show you a couple of examples of what crazy time signatures look like, right? They could be anything. Right, so right here you see a 3/4. That means there are 3 quarter notes in these measures. This is a 3/8, right? There's 3 eighth notes. 2/4. There's 2 quarter notes. This is like a quiz, right? Here's a good one. 5/8. There's 5 eighth notes in a measure. Right? 4/4. 4 quarter notes. 3 quarter notes. 3 eighth notes. 2 quarter notes, and so forth. Right, I chose this piece of music. This is an uncommon piece of music. You wouldn't typically see this many key or time changes in music, but that is something. And to compare, this is a piece of music that has no time signature, and the only rhythmic value you see here are whole notes. And this is from a piece, or from a collection of pieces called the Unmeasured Preludes. As you can see, there are no measures, there's no time signature, there are no rhythms other than whole notes. So this is to contrast. This is something that is on the absolute other end of the spectrum of what rhythm could look like. And then we ended our class looking at some chant, right? So this is now stuff that you will maybe start to see and notice in services, right? Pastor Alex will be chanting something, often a Kyrie. He usually chants towards the beginning of a service. And this is the kind of music that he's looking at. The stuff that's in brackets here, in parentheses. Right? So he's chanting this note. Lord, oh Lord, open thou our lips, right? Oh God, make speed to save us. That's kind of what he's looking at, right? So it's just interesting, right? How rhythm is used, but it is the core of all of the music that we look at and all the music that we hear. Right? We had a fun discussion about, well, what happens if you don't have a conductor or a metronome, like in a band? Well, that's the job of a drummer, right? There's always something in music that will that has to orient us to the beat, or else music doesn't make sense at all. So I hope that is helpful. And if you have questions throughout the week, or if you're looking at any of this and you're confused, here, I'm going to put this up, then please ask. Yeah? We'll briefly review this before the next class, but we're going to go onward and learn how to actually count and clap and make sense of these. So let me know if you have